Let's start. See, when we talk about civilizations, especially the European civilization, it is something that is divided into three parts. One part is the ancient part, in which you have the Greeks and the Romans. And the other part that you have is the medieval part. The medieval part uh, is that part of the civilization which is uh, dominated by Christianity. And the third part is called the modern civilization, which begins around the 16th, 17th centuries CE or Common Era. And this is something that we are still living with, even though there have been some attempts at disruption of this classification by saying postmodernism. Uh, Postmodernism, as such, has no definite existence, no definite uh, meaning of its own, and therefore, we don't really have to worry about postmodernism at this point. At this point, we say modernity is something which is definitely, uh, what should we say, definitely worth studying. Now, modernity actually begins with people like John Locke uh, and you have Adam Smith. And modernity is coterminous with rising capitalism. Just as you have modernity rising, along with that, you have capitalism also rising. In fact, it's the other way around. It's because of the capitalist civilization and the Protestant ethic that was there in the uh, Reformation movement. Uh, that is basically the reason why modernity happened. If you are looking at what modernity does or what modernity did, if you look at it, then what you find is that modernity changed the very nature of European civilization. Depending on whom you are, if you are Jean-Jacques Rousseau, or if you are uh, Karl Marx, then you will say modernity is something that created alienation among the people. But I'm taking a great leap forward here. I just want you to store away this information in your head. We'll talk about it at length when we talk about Hegel, because I don't think last semester you gave me an opportunity to end the semester properly. So I couldn't do so with you, but I'll initiate a discussion and comparison between Rousseau and Hegel. And later on, we can also have some kind of this thing exchange of information about Rousseau, Hegel, and Karl Marx. Now, if we are looking at modernity, what are its features? See, if you look at the medieval period, what we find in the medieval period is uh, two medieval period of European history, which has many times been called world history, but it is not world history. It is just uh, it is basically just what should we say? Um, Medieval period uh, is synonymous with the rise of Christendom. So let's put it that way. And there were two main sources of authority that governed the life of an individual. Now, individual in the pre-modern period, any pre-modern period, including the ancient and the medieval, you will find is something that is got more and more to do with it has got more and more to do with the whole thing, which is what we call uh, control over the individual's life. In fact, what we find in the modern period, which is an attempt at creating a separate realm, which is called the private realm, in which nobody interferes, but it is your realm. And the other realm is the public realm, in which you come out and you interact with others. And rules of what should I say? The rules of social interaction are laid out reasonably clearly in this particular realm, which is the public realm. Whereas in the private realm, it's entirely you, yourself, and so nobody actually would interfere in that. Now, there is a thing that you must understand. This distinction between the public and the private realms of human activity is something that is only applicable to a certain extent even today. It is not something that is applicable universally all the uh, to all the areas of human life. In fact, what many people consider to be a private realm is not always a private realm. Sometimes it's a private realm, sometimes it is not a private realm. If you look at this, for example, suicide. You may say suicide is my life and I'll take my life if I want. And but it will not be considered to be an act of that which concerns only you. Because if you have parents, if you have children, if you have the spouse, then suicide is likely to impact upon all these people. I'm not giving you the typical Christian answer here, which is suicide is a sin. Just as murder is a sin, suicide or taking your own life is also a sin. I'm not talking about it in the sin sense of the term. What I'm only trying to say is that suicide is something that many people basically talk about as if it is something that uh, is applicable only to particular selves, but it is not. So you see, even what people think is a private realm doesn't often turn out to be a private realm. In fact, let's say you're fond of eating ice cream, and you may say, I'm earning my money. And I like the idea of eating ice cream. So let me eat as much ice cream as I want to. That again has ramifications for others because if you eat as much ice cream as you want to, it can lead to blockages of the arteries uh, around the heart, and that may eventually even lead to your death. You may become extremely overweight. Uh, so, though,
Sorry to intervene.
sorry,
Sorry to intervene, sir. I had one doubt.
yeah,
Sir, is this public realm associated with J.S. Mill's other regarding principle?
yes, self-regarding is the private realm, and other regarding is the uh, public realm. Yes, but if you look at Mill very carefully, he hardly finds anything that fits into the self-regarding only. In fact, the example of suicide that I've given you is the example that Mill himself gives. Uh, so, I mean, if you read his On Liberty is not all about how much freedom you have, but it is also about how much of your freedoms are restricted by other responsibilities. And though nobody has actually talked about Mill in this particular manner, one thing that is very clear about Mill is that Mill has also got a moral angle to his philosophy. He says you can't be responsible for the birth of people and die uh, without looking after them, and which is nothing but a moral principle. So, yeah, Mill's others regarding and self regarding actions do fall broadly under the category of the public and the private realm. Though Mill is not the originator of this argument, the argument probably goes to Rousseau. In Rousseau, you find this particular argument in a very amorphous sense, and you also find it in Karl Marx in when they talk about alienation. Uh, in fact, uh, Marx talks about three kinds of alienation. He says alienation from the product, alienation from the self, and finally alienation from the species being. But that we'll have opportunity to discuss after we finish with Hegel. And Hegel himself is another philosopher who has a strong argument of alienation. Hegel talks about what we call positive law, uh, and he calls positivity. Now, positivity is not always something very nice. Positivity for him is sometimes something which is in the nature of something which is not very nice. Uh, for instance, when the pandemic was happening, okay, you'd say the positivity rate of testing was reaching at one time around 30%. And people said 30% is too high. And in countries like America, it even went beyond 50% into 60% and all that. So that is the rate of positivity. So the rate of positivity is not always necessarily a good thing just because it says positive. If too many people test positive for a disease, then that means you have a pandemic. If not a pandemic, at least an epidemic. Okay, so that is one thing that you have to keep in mind, that while we are using these terms, uh, in fact, positivity can also be used, replaced by dead objectivity. Okay, a dead objectivity is positive law because you are sticking to a principle which is supposed to be objective, not subjective, but you don't know why you are sticking to it. So that makes it a dead objectivity. When you don't understand the logic of a principle that you are following, then that only gets described as dead objectivity. Now, so to return back to the argument of public and private, the private aspects of life are very few. There are more and more public aspects of life. And if you see the Greeks or any ancient civilization for that matter, you will find that the possibilities of calling something private doesn't exactly exist at all. That is why in his Politeia, or the Republic, as we call it in English, uh, Plato argues about several things which are unacceptable to us. One of the things that he actually argues about, and that which is unacceptable to us, is the fact that he can tell you don't read or write poetry. Now, if it comes naturally to write poetry, or you take some pleasure in reading poems, there is absolutely no reason why you should not like poetry. You should, in fact, read poetry. That is what we'll tell today. But back in Hegel's time, it wasn't so. Not in Hegel's time, sorry. Back in the Greek time, it wasn't so. Plato even felt free to tell you what to eat and what not to eat. And so this is something that is probably inconceivable, but it is not completely absent. I mean, if you go to a doctor with a certain kind of a complaint, if you go with a complaint which turns out to be diabetes, then the doctor will give you a diet chart and tell you that this is what you have to eat and this is what you have to do. This is what you have to stick to in order to be able to uh, be called uh, in order to be cautious and in order to keep the disease under control. So that's what I said. There are limitations on what we think is private. Just because it's my private life, I can't eat as much sugar as I want. That can cause diabetes. And not only can it cause diabetes, it can accelerate the diabetes process, which ultimately becomes a comorbidity. And then, in the final sense, it also becomes a morbidity factor. So, you see that the Greeks and the Romans had no distinction of what is private and what is not private. If you, at the same time, if you look at the, if you look at the people who are, what should I say, who are in the Middle Ages, they had two, apart from the fact that each individual could control the individual life of another individual in a limited sort of way. You have two organizations in the medieval period which exerted tremendous influence upon um, uh, the life of an individual. So the individual is here, and in the uh, Greek period, we find that the individual is nothing but a physical individual. Because I am a physical individual, let us say, and if you try to basically, if you try to divide me, then I will not live anymore. I'll be dead. And in that sense, I am the rock bottom principle where you cannot divide me anymore. Okay, so that is the sense in which we have individuals as entities, physical entities who cannot be divided any further. Society can be divided into its constituent elements, which are individuals, but you cannot divide individuals into anything anymore. So, given this, you will find that there are two very, very big, what should I say? There are two very big sources of control over the individual's life in this whole thing, which we call the medieval period in European history. Now, the first all-encompassing and all-powerful institution is the Roman Church. And the second very powerful institution, which controlled the lives of individuals, is something which is called the feudal professional guilds. Now, one thing that differentiates, say, feudalism from capitalism, in capitalism, production happens for profit. Okay. Whereas in feudalism, production happens only if there is consumption, which means if you want a table, then you will go to a carpenter and ask him to make a table for you, and then he'll set out making a table. It might take a little time, but he'll ultimately make it for you. Or similarly, if you want a gold chain made for yourself, then you go to a goldsmith. Or if you want something made out of iron and metals like that, steel, then you would go to a blacksmith. Okay, so these are the professions that you find in the medieval period. The professions are mostly about these. Sorry. Yeah. So the uh, thing that you find is that these professional guilds are those which are formed by the time somebody is born. When you're born, if you're born into a family of carpenters, then it is already decided for you that you will become a carpenter. If you are born into the family of a goldsmith or a blacksmith or a potter or any of those professions, you will see that you have to take up that profession that your family has traditionally taken up. Okay, so given that kind of a thing, what you do find is that there is a bit of a problem. And the bit of a problem is something that pertains to this whole idea of uh, the lack of choice for a person to choose a profession of his liking. Okay, somebody might like the idea of being uh, a doctor, but you couldn't be a doctor unless you were born into a family of doctors. And this is an attitude that still persists in India, for example. Very few people have a choice of what they should do because if you look at a number of people, you will see that these people are the ones who would like to do something else, but are driven to be, for example, if you are born into a family of lawyers, then somebody or the other will expect you to take up the position of a lawyer. Why will they ask you to expect you to take up the position of a lawyer? They'll do that because of the fact that they are looking at uh, utilizing, if you've been into a lawyer's house or a lawyer's office, you realize that there are stacks and stacks of books, and there are case files which have precedents and some which have more than just precedents, judging judgments on certain types of issues. So if you look into that, then what you basically realize is that these stacks of books that are there, they'll go waste if nobody takes up the profession. So they expect somebody to take up a lawyer's profession simply because of the fact that you know you want the practice to continue. You want to have the same clients. I pass on the practice to my son, my daughter, and they continue to practice. And later on, hopefully, they'll pass on the practice to their children. So we do have this even now. It's not something that is completely gone, especially in the case of India. Though it is a lot less muted and a lot less overtly visible in the case of Western countries. Okay, and so what you must understand is that these are very strong methods of control. Or even if you go to a middle class family, nobody might be an engineer there. But given the fact that engineering studies is affordable and at one time it was desirable, not anymore. Even though it is not a desirable profession anymore, there are still people talking about how they should have their children study, you know, looking at engineering. Okay, and you'll see that the backward states also have this other uh, phenomenon, which is the pursuit of civil services. If you're confident, you have a very, very vibrant uh, uh, you say private sector today. And this particular private sector has more jobs than any public sector organization can give you. But what you don't get in the private sector is a guarantee that you'll hold on to your job, irrespective of you performing well in the job or not performing well in the job. So that is what decides things in the private sector. Now, if you look at the public sector, the best example is the university you go to. People don't come to class. The students will say the teachers don't come to class. The teachers will say students don't come to class. And in the meanwhile, for whatever reason, people have other kinds of ambitions, political ambitions. And in order to nurture them and fulfill them, people will do a lot of things which are actually not becoming of a lecturer or a teacher. Okay, and what you find is people conducting lectures, series of lectures on some nonsense. And then the latest thing that I have seen is Mahaniyula Utsavalu. Mahaniyulu, I expect, is great people. But in doing this, you are only including Ambedkar. Ambedkar, who never took part in the freedom movement, who never went to jail, in fact, wanted the continuation of the British rule here, and Pule, who was also somebody who converted to Christianity, wanted the continuation of British colonialism. And he wanted to work with them actively. And so what does he do? He becomes a contractor for the British. And what does he do as a contractor? He builds jails, including the famous Yerawada jail in Pune. And who are incarcerated in these jails? Freedom fighters. Okay, so this is a very myopic, hopeless way of looking at the world. So even if you hate Gandhi, even if you hate Nehru, you can't possibly say that all the people who went to jails are only upper class and upper caste people. No, they weren't. There are lots of lower caste and lower class people who went to jails. Why don't you take that into consideration while making your rules? Right? But you don't take them into consideration. You say Mahaniyulu or Ambedkar and Pule and maybe Sayaji, Raja Sayaji, because he had some admiration for Pule. But these are not people who are without faults. They have their own faults. And if you take the case of Ambedkar, for example, uh, Ambedkar said that the Dalits will not participate in the freedom movement and they will not oppose British rule, and in fact, they will ask you to continue the British rule in this country because the British will then treat everyone equally. They'll treat the Brahmin and the untouchable equally. That was Ambedkar's view, which in my with due consideration, I humbly disagree with. For the simple reason that Englishmen weren't treating everybody as slaves in India. They weren't treating everybody as slaves in India. They were only treating some people. The others were British educated. You had the Indian civil service, in which you had officers of Indian origin, not origin, you had Indian officers. And these Indian officers were all mostly Brahmins. Why? Because the Brahmins had their education in different languages in the past. They had at one time studied as a race, not as individuals. They had at one time studied Sanskrit and the knowledge derived out of Sanskrit. And then when the Islamic period came into India, which is the medieval period in India, the Islamic period, most of the courts in India had this particular uh, language called Persian, which was the official language of the people, official language of the court of a particular king. And in this particular court, you needed people to write a karnama. Karnama basically means a list of what activities have happened, what activities are to be taken up, and by when are they to be completed. All those things have to be written, and they have to be written in Persian. And the people who again learned this language and became the Karnama writers were upper caste, mainly the Brahmins again. Okay, and if you look at Akbar, in Akbar's this thing you find both his general of the army was Man Singh, and one of his strong advisors, military advisors, Jai Singh, and his prime minister, Birbal, were all, Birbal was a Brahmin, and the others were all Rajputs. So who benefited from the foreign rule? Yet again, if you take the Islamic rule as foreign, which you shouldn't, for the simple reason that unlike the Britishers who came here, taught uh, what they wanted to the people so that they'll function as accessories to the British Empire, and plundered the resources from here and uh, took that to their own country, where these resources grew and they became bigger and more flexible in size. So development took place there while nothing happened. Yeah. Okay. So the very well-known story is that of cotton. India grows a lot of cotton, always. Even today, it grows a lot of cotton. And this cotton was taken and used for developing cloth mills in Manchester. So Manchester became the center for trading in cotton garments. And where did the cotton come from? Not from Britain. It came from India, or it went from India rather. And they took this free of cost. That is the colonial angle. They took the resource, the uh, raw material, free of cost, created something out of it, and brought it back and sold it in this particular country. And it was Gandhi who therefore said Swadeshi, not the BJP who BJP talks Swadeshi, walks Videshi. Okay. Uh, so what you have to understand is that if you look at the whole process of British rule, British rule meant that nothing happened here. Absolutely nothing happened here. While most of the development took place in England. And if you look at the cities that were developed, uh, what were the cities that were developed? Delhi, which was the capital, and Calcutta, which was a port, Vishakhapatnam, mildly developed, again, because it was a port. On the eastern shore, the other very big port was Madras, and on the western side, you had Calicut, which was developed as a port, and you had Bombay, which was again a very big port, and I forget the name of the city, and I don't think it is Surat, but one of the cities in Gujarat also became a port city. And if you look at the way the railways were laid, the railways were laid by the British in such a manner that they identified the hinterland of the country, the inside of the country, where you could find these raw materials, resources, and you would take them by train to these port cities. So that led to what we call enclave development in India. The only exception to that was, funnily enough, Hyderabad, because of the pact that the nature of the pact that the uh, Nizam of Hyderabad had with the British, saying that, listen, you don't touch me, I won't touch you. I won't get into any alliances with anybody to fight with you. So even the great 1857 revolt that took place, in that you don't see the Nizam or you don't see Hyderabad anywhere in the picture. Okay, but the Nizam, despite what might be considered treachery by nationalists and patriots, had started developing his own kingdom. Uh, the composite Hyderabad state was not just Telangana, as people say. Today, people say Hyderabad is a part of Telangana. This is the biggest lie that has ever been told to the world. Okay, Hyderabad was a state, it was not a city. Okay, it was a state, the composite Hyderabad state, or the Nizam state as it was sometimes called, but its technical designation was the composite Hyderabad state. So, in this, what did you have? You had regions of Telangana, you had regions of coastal Andhra, which were ceded to the Nizam because Hyderabad was a landlocked state and the Nizam wanted a port. So he asked for the Machilipatnam port near Vijayawada. And along with that, uh, the two other districts that were ceded were right up to the Palnadu area, which were Vijayawada and Guntur. And some people say even Eluru, but I'm not very sure of that. Uh, but you did have these different, what should we say, uh, parts of what is today being called coastal Andhra, the othering that has happened in the separate Telangana movement. The othering that happened on a caste basis. It didn't happen on a regional basis. you should understand that the separate Telangana movement was not based in any kind of regionalism. It was based only in casteism. It was Reddys, the feudal Reddys here, who didn't at first want the Brahmins to do anything here. And then later on, the threat became even more imminent the uh, when basically the uh, Kamas came from these two districts, especially Vijayawada and Guntur, which are otherwise not outside the scope of the Hyderabad composite state. So you see, therefore, that this othering that was done with a particular view to keep out people of a certain community. So Andhra go back was the Nara, and then people realized that you don't have a port here. So if you continue to have enmity with the port, then it'll become with the areas which have ports, then it'll become a difficult thing for Hyderabad. A realization that dawned rather late on the TRS. And the TRS also realized that it can win two elections, maybe three if it is lucky, maybe three elections, but never, not necessarily the fourth consecutive election. It wouldn't have. People say even it's not going to win the third consecutive election. I'm not going to sit into psephology here. Even if we assume that it is going to win the third election, it won't win the fourth. So then what happens to it? As long as it is called only Telangana Rashtra Samiti, where else will it go and contest? So Telangana, for which this party claims responsibility for having uh, gotten this state, a separate Telangana, drops the Telangana from its name and becomes Bharat Rashtriya Samiti. Because with Bharat, they can contest anywhere. They even tried to become a local party of Andhra Pradesh. And there the election commission said, no, you're not a local party here. You can anyone can contest elections, but you don't get the status of a local party. So here are the people who fought for a separate Telangana, who are now sitting and working to get a local status in coastal Andhra or Andhra Pradesh, as it is technically called. Okay, a central university has been set up in Anantapur, and it is manned by people of Telangana. It is all people who support the BJP. They are the ones who are sitting there and manning that particular university. And when recruitment is going to happen, you find that the maximum number of applicants for jobs in that central university are basically the maximum number of these things that are happening are basically from Telangana, the applications. So you said Andhras shouldn't get a job here, but you're willing to go and work there. So you see, there is a diabolic component to all this. And this is because of the fact that in the modern period, the individual has been able to somehow technically break himself self free of uh, the strong forces that were holding the person in particular feudal community, feudal professional guild, or the church which peeped into your life, your thoughts. What was the confession? The confession was nothing but you go sit in front of a priest and say, "Forgive me, Father, I have sinned." So the priest benevolently asks you, "What have you done, my child?" And he or she will say, "I did this, I did that." If you didn't do anything bad, if you had a bad thought, and what was a bad thought? If you felt attracted to a boy, if you were a girl, or if you were a girl who felt attracted to a boy, then this itself had to be confessed. Now, what did this uh, church do? It exploited this information to the hilt. And by exploiting this information to the hilt, what the church was able to do was essentially create fear among the people by saying that if you are not careful, we will divulge this information to everyone. Actually, you are supposed that the priest who is taking the confession is supposed to be under an oath that he'll keep to himself whatever details of sin that have been confessed to him. But the reality was exactly the opposite of this. So you see, what happens with this, therefore, is that you have a problem. The problem is that you have invasion into the privacy of individuals. And it was far, far difficult for young girls because the priests or the clergy, they sought sexual favors from these girls in return for their silence and in return for not divulging what thoughts or what acts were committed by the girls. So that was actually the undoing of the Christian church, uh, which culminated in the sale of indulgences. And the sale of indulgences was actually, uh, the Bible was not available for everyone to read as like it is today. Bible was available only in Latin. It was called the Vulgate, and it was available only to the clergy. So it was believed that the clergy knew something that ordinary people did not know. They knew how to communicate with God, and that is the reason why the confession. You confess to a clergyman, and the clergyman will say, "I will talk to God and secure a pardon for you. Come back tomorrow." That is how it was. So you see that there is no domain called the personal here. Nothing is personal, everything is in public. So, under those circumstances, what we saw is the conditions for rebellion taking place. And when the Renaissance happened, what the Renaissance did was that it furthered the conditions for the rebellion. If you remember what I told you in your first semester, this I remember having told you, that ancient Greek period can be divided into four. The first phase is the Milesian phase, the second phase is the Eleatic phase, the third phase is the Athenian phase, and the fourth phase is the Hellenistic phase. Now, these are all different geographies, not just one part. Okay, so by the time we come to the Hellenistic phase, in the Hellenistic phase, you had Greek scholars who came to hide along the Mediterranean Sea. Hellenistic province is there, the Hellenes, as it is called. And it is here that scholars kept the knowledge with them, suppressed it among themselves, and stayed. Once the Renaissance happened and the rebellion against the church had happened, these scholars came out into the open. They moved from the Hellenes to the Italian principalities, and there they started opening up all the old knowledge, half investigated sometimes, mostly half investigated knowledge to various people. So uh, that is what you should consider as the reason why during the Renaissance, somebody asked me once, "Sir, why is it that people shut up for so many days and suddenly where was this Greek learning?" Greek learning was in the Hellenistic area, and they didn't come out fearing, persecution by the church, the Roman church. And once the Renaissance happened, revival revival of learning, or actually revival of classical learning. Renaissance is rebirth. In English, it is renaissance. In Italian and Latin, it was renaissance. So it happened and it brought out this new knowledge. We'll stop here today. Tomorrow we'll pick up the Protestant ethic and Reformation. And once we do that, we will go on to modernity. And there's not much to be said about modernity once we understand these things. Okay, so please remember that till the modern age, the most significant factor that was there in the lives of people was ethical living. Ethical living, as the Greeks called it, virtuous living, as the Christians called it. And the Christians, I'm sure you know the Neoplatonists and the Neo-Aristotelians. So, but I'm not going to teach all that now. If you had come last semester to classes, I would have. But since you people decided that what I'm teaching you is binge and that it has nothing to do with anything useful in life, well, if you have learnt it on your own, fantastic. But if you haven't, God bless you. Thank you very much, Harshita. Tomorrow we will not have a class in the evening. Would you like to have a class in the morning? Or would you like a day off?
Anything is fine, sir. Having a class or not having a class, anything is fine.
No, evening I can't have a class because I have a commitment. Normally I don't take classes on Saturdays. But since we basically started today, I don't want to take 2 days off immediately after starting. So we'll have probably a brief class in the morning,
Okay, sir. Yeah. Yes. I will.
11, 11 o'clock.
Okay, sir.
At least let me finish off the Protestant ethic. Then we can go on to the other things.
Okay, sir.
Okay?
Yes, sir.
11 o'clock it is then. See
Thank
you.
you.
Yeah,
Thanks.
yeah. See you.